See that giant start stopping?
All right, are we rolling? All right, this is Unit 1, Question 3. Most state constitutions reflect a belief in legislative supremacy. Why? Blah, blah, blah. You may begin.
In his Rights of Man, Thomas Paine wrote, "A constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government." Upon drafting state constitutions, Americans in the newly freed and independent states first developed their expectations for democracy, such as popular sovereignty, limited government, and protection of natural rights. These democratic ideals would later be mimicked in writing the United States Constitution.
While principles of constitutionalism and republicanism were not originally developed by state constitutions, John Denton was correct in that they were formalized in these documents and then adopted at the federal level. Proportional representation, an aspect of republicanism, had an early application in the Virginia House of Burgesses, where the council consisted of 2 burgesses out of every town, hundred, or plantation.
This system was solidified in the Virginia Constitution, where the House of Delegates had representatives apportioned by county. Exclusion of this tenet in the Articles of Confederation resulted in its fulfillment in Article 1, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. A principle of constitutionalism, checks and balances, existed prior to state constitutions in the New York Charter, where the royal governor and ultimately the king could veto any bill passed by the assembly.
Upon writing the Massachusetts Constitution, John Adams wrote that it is by balancing each power, legislative, executive, or judicial, against the other 2, that the effort in human nature toward tyranny can alone be checked. These checks and balances were adopted into our Constitution, and provisions such as the power of the executive to curb that of the legislature in Article 2.
It was not necessarily a state of nature, but a state of emergency that propelled states to create constitutions post-1775 to solidify revised forms of government to maintain state sovereignty. Following the Declaration of Independence, British colonial charters were discontinued. Only state assemblies and committees had retained authority through popular consent. Thus, limited government was created. Acknowledging Emery Vattel's idea that a sovereign government is one that protects natural rights, states, beginning with Virginia, included a Declaration of Rights in their constitutions.
These declarations guaranteed what had been known as the rights of Englishmen in the Magna Carta, something that the colonists believed they deserved, including due process, writ of habeas corpus, and property rights. This would later be reflected in the Bill of Rights that allowed for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Through these constitutions, each state was able to act as what Justice Louis D. Brandeis termed laboratories of democracy, implementing state sovereignty.
Conflicts between the colonists, the royal governors, and the British monarch led to the Revolution, rendering the states cautious of a strong executive and favorable towards legislative supremacy. In J.W. Hampton and Company versus U.S., Congress was given certain control of executive officers' public regulations, continuing the idea that legislative power is a check upon the executive. Furthermore, expressed by John Locke in his second treatise on government, legislative supremacy provides for the authenticity of the social contract, for there remains still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter a legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in legislators.
However, as was seen by the 112th Congress's failure to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act and the Senate's recent lack of votes to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act, controversy within a powerful legislature slows the progress of society. This was further emphasized by the 2013 government shutdown.
Through constitutions, states were able to create independent governments to comply with specific public standards of constitutionalism and republicanism particular to each. Dual constitutionalism was formed when the Constitution not only adopted these principles, but also endorsed the idea of state sovereignty through the 10th Amendment. Thank you.
408. You probably could have lost that 8 seconds just by some of the stumbling.
Change the parts.
Okay, who's got the first question?
Why do you think most state constitutions begin with a preamble and a Declaration of Rights?
Most state constitutions began with a Declaration of Rights simply because they did not include these in their constitutions. Therefore, the people thought that they needed rights enumerated somehow.
This would later be why there was controversy over the passing of the U.S. Constitution, because it didn't have a Bill of Rights added to the document. The Federalists believed that the rights that would be in a Bill of Rights would either be incorporated into the Articles of the Constitution or in states. So the fact that states had these declarations and preambles enumerating rights and the principles the constitutions were based on were part of the Federalist argument.
Continuing off of Elise, you could actually see dual constitutionalism in this. The fact that not all state constitutions prior to the Constitution had these Bill of Rights. There were actually only 3 states that enumerated the right to freedom of speech. So once the Constitution was created, a lot of these states rewrote their own state constitutions to better fit the federal government's constitution.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll just choose. I was trying to follow the question. Do the development of state constitutions between 1777 and 1785 reveal a consistent belief in the principle of separated powers and checks and balances?
The Delaware State Constitution of 1776 reflected that the citizens of Delaware did not believe strongly in the separation of powers because their legislative branch was the one who chose their executive, and essentially the executive was dependent on the legislative branch for military orders and money. And so by not creating a strong separate executive, they discounted this idea of separation of powers.
The Massachusetts Constitution of 1776, written by John Adams, initially set up the checks and balance system that we see in our Constitution today, with the executive, judicial, and legislative, each having a separation of powers between each.
Also, in the colonial period, a lot of these colonial governments had these checks and balance systems where even in the state of Maryland, their governor could actually veto bills created by the legislature. So these kind of colonial governments were passed on to these state constitutions and these same kind of ideas.
Why a proportional representative government?
Under Great Britain, the American colonies were considered to be part of Great Britain, and they were in the sphere of universal representation. Therefore, every representative of Great Britain represented every single colony, such as India and the American colonies. So when they broke away from Great Britain, they saw universal representation as something that didn't represent the people well, and so they went to this form of proportional representation.
Furthermore, in the Declaration of Independence, one of the usurpations said that King George III had failed to create laws for the accommodations of large districts of people. And what the colonists wanted truly was representation that could represent different populations, not just universal, where everyone would have the same amount of votes, but the population wouldn't be the same, and so the representation wouldn't be justified.
If we talk about a proportional government, what impact does gerrymandering have? Is it a negative or a positive impact on proportional representation?
It's definitely a negative because when gerrymandering happens, the majority party can try to drown out the minorities in that area so they don't get a vote.
However, I would like to disagree. The gerrymandering can be beneficial in some instances because if, for example, minorities are grouped together, then they can have a stronger influence and pick a candidate who will represent their ideas.
When you look at the creation of the Constitution, political parties weren't actually incorporated yet. They had not been created. So when they thought of this idea of proportional representation, you can't exactly say that gerrymandering was something they thought of because they believed that people would be elected off of their moral standing, not because of party politics.
You guys have a question down there?
Sure. Doesn't the existence of the pardon power within the executive branch undermine the principles of constitutional government? Why or why not?
It does undermine the Constitution because the president is supposed to uphold rule of law, and if the people that he's pardoning, they're in jail because they did not follow the rule of law. Therefore, he's not upholding by pardoning.
In Article 2 of the Constitution, it says that the job of the executive or the president is to faithfully execute the law. And in a case where a law no longer is applicable to a state and someone is in prison or in jail because of this law, I believe it is the right and the duty of the president to be able to pardon that person because they are suffering from past offenses that are no longer applicable.
I would like to agree with Tylo. Pardoning is constitutional because when the founders created Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, they specifically left it more or less open to have specific standards set by presidents like George Washington. So, for example, when President Ford pardoned Nixon right after coming into office, he was simply executing a power that had been set by his predecessors.
Time. You want to go ahead and ask?
5 questions. She said we did 5 questions.
Yes, but
Yeah, they did 5. Oh, you said 5? Oh, I thought you said
Is that a
that.
good number of questions?
Okay, Alexa, turn your testimony over. Okay. Using your big girl voice, outdoor voice, start it up.
In his Rights of Man, Thomas Paine wrote, "A constitution is not the act
Okay, that's what I want to hear.
of..." Okay.
Get it?
Got it.
Remember we talked about that. You're the lead off, man. You got to get everybody's attention.
Okay, was that good?
That's better.
Okay.
Okay? It's still, you could still be louder and it wouldn't hurt. Remember? That there is what you want to be talking to, not to us here. Okay?
I would
Yeah,
think
talk to Big
about-
Chief.
Get our attention. And you can do that. It's just, you don't have the big voice. You got to make the big voice. Okay?
Especially if you're following up by me.
Okay, so we need to balance a little bit, and that's why I wanted to, and I don't mean to embarrass you, I apologize if I did.
No, I got it.
But, you're kicking this off, okay? You're getting it rolling. So,
Okay.
be loud, be
Got
forceful,
it.
get our attention, and then
Forceful,
let us focus
got
in on you.
And
Okay.
if this helps, I told this to one of the other groups, but if you feel like you need to emphasize a sentence or a word more, bold it on your paper so that you know when you look at it, you say, I need to speak louder on this part. So you actively think of it. Let me think. Oh, also, your rule of law for the pardon power answer, I think what you could use there is, I think last year, I believe it was the Mississippi governor who pardoned like half of the convicts in his prison, which is not cool. You could use that as an example to build up your case about how he can't do that.
All right, thank you.
Oh, California's looking at doing it just for economic reasons.
Yeah.
Okay, we need to hear from you.
Okay, sure. First off, Alexis, in the intro, go a little bit faster. I think that would
Okay.
be a little better. Also, in the question when Ms. Gold asked about gerrymandering, another thing you can bring up is how immigration reform isn't being brought up in Congress, the House of Representatives, because most congressmen there don't have to be reproached by their constituents because they have drowned out the minority, as Alexis pointed out. I was going to ask this question, but I didn't have time. In one of the main arguments during the revolution was that universal representation did not represent everyone fairly. However, how does that relate to the numbers now? I mean, it's one representative, I don't know the exact number, but represents so many people. Is that still proportional representation? Is it becoming universal representation?
Now you know why she's on our side. And we wish she was on the other side, but you.
And that is an interesting point of view because if you take a look at our own state and how we elect our legislature and the power lying in Clark County, the rural counties are really hung out to dry. And if you have a legislator who has to cover 6 rural counties, that's impossible. Absolutely impossible. And the needs of the rurals are so different from Washoe County and so different from Clark County. So how does that impact real, true representation?
Okay, you guys have 5 questions in 6 minutes, and as far as I'm concerned, you had great balance. You had great substance to your answers. You played off each other very, very well. So, you know, I think you're on track with that, just with some of the things that we mentioned. You know, I was trying to find a way to tie in the Bundy case, because every unit's gonna have to do that, and they had a question they probably could have with the, why were civilian militias and the right to bear arms provided in the states. Okay, that could be part of it, but again, as we mentioned to other groups, current events, current events, current events. From now on, be looking at all the current events that are going on, and how does it relate to anything even relatively close to something that might come your way.
And you might check our state constitution about the creation of a civilian militia. Just out of curiosity. We have a very strange
Civilian
state
militia.
constitution.
Okay,
Also, question, for the pardoning question, would political favors work as a negative? Just as a political favor to pardon someone?
oh, sure.
Uh-huh.
It'll come back and bite you somewhere. Somebody will get it and they'll use it against you in an election. But, you know, what would be the purpose of doing it? And that would be the first question. But yeah, that would not be a very positive thing. It happens.
But your eye contact was good, your use of hands, your body language was good, you sat up straight, you kept your hands away from your mouth. It's just, remember that when you're back east, when you're in Washington, it's as if you were going to be testifying before Congress, and members of Congress demand a certain level of, what's the word I want? Give me a word.
Respect?
Well,
They don't
yeah.
get it,
Decency.
but- Well, it's
And
a
your
level of
demeanor.
professionalism in your demeanor and in your presentation.
As I said
your
before,
appearance.
no dangly earrings, skirts at least at knee level, things like that. I know that sounds old-fashioned, but believe it or not, that's what
They are
Congress
very,
wants.
they are big
That's
on
how
that.
you get respect.
Well, and I think you guys have done well with that, you know, from all the competitions we've seen so far.
Sometimes I push the limits on my skirts, but.
You do. I want to see the hemline down a little bit. But, all right, guys. Good
Okay.
job.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
You're well
But you don't want to
prepared.
go through
So what are we doing last? Thank you very much.
What unit are we got now? 4, and you're doing what?
Yeah, 4-2.
For question 2.
Yeah, we're doing 2.
Not bad. That's what I was actually doing.
I'm reading for Henry and myself.
Yeah,
No,
I'm
you're not.
Henry too.
Grab something.
They could borrow. Hey, Will, come here. You're gonna read for Henry.
Okay, like we've done before. I know you may have done it in another room.
All right, Jay, you're gonna read. Then pass me my paper after you read. But are they the same? Because then it makes me feel.
Okay. unit
Well, we're
four.
just gonna see you.
Hold on, but I'm okay.
Question 2.
This is Henry's
Henry right here. Oh yeah, that's fine. Okay, what are you reading? Introduction statement.
Do you have a question?
I think it's still recording, actually.
We'll just stop until we're ready.